I was on my way to pick up a loaf of bread and some coffee filters when it happened. Funny how the smallest things can open the deepest doors in your memory. The automatic doors of the supermarket slid apart with that soft whoosh I've heard 1,000 times, but I didn't step inside right away. There he was, sitting patiently, tied to the metal rail just by the entrance. A small brown dog, probably a mix, with those eyes only dogs can have. Part loyalty, part longing, part quiet sadness. His tail wagged every now and then, as if reminding himself his owner would come back. I stopped right there, hand resting on the cart handle, and for a moment I wasn't 65 anymore. I wasn't a man with thinning gray hair and knees that crackle in the morning. I was 20 again, smelling of hay and iodine, standing outside my first clinic in a little town no one outside of Illinois ever cared to remember. The sight of that dog waiting brought it all rushing back. The mornings that smelled of sawdust and disinfectant, the sound of cows mooing at dawn, the way farmers would drive in with pickups that rattled like old bones, carrying sick calves or limping dogs in their beds. It's strange. You think you've tucked all those years away neatly, folded into the drawers of memory. But then one leash, one waiting animal, and the whole dresser spills open. I stood there a while, watching the dog, feeling my chest ache in that bittersweet way it does when the past comes back too clear. And so I begin to tell you my story, not because it's extraordinary, but because it was mine. A life lived in barns and clinics, among neighbors and strangers, with blood on my hands some days, and gratitude in my heart most days. I didn't plan to think of all this on a Tuesday afternoon outside a grocery store, but maybe that's how memory works. It ambushes you, like a dog waiting by the door, reminding you who you once were. I grew up in a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in less than half an hour. The streets were quiet, lined with maples that turned golden in the fall, and kids rode their bikes without worrying about traffic. Life felt simple then, though at the time I didn't think much of it. My earliest memory of wanting to care for animals came when I was about 7. Our neighbor, old Mr. Harris, kept a small farm with a handful of dairy cows and a barn cat that prowled around like she owned the place. One summer afternoon, I found that cat limping in the tall grass by the fence. She had a cut on her paw. Nothing serious, but to a boy of 7, it felt like the whole world depended on me fixing her. I remember the way my hands shook as I carried her home. The smell of her dusty fur, the warmth of her tiny body pressed against my chest. My mother let me clean her paw with warm water, then wrapped it gently with a strip of cloth she tore from an old bedsheet. The cat sat there, still as stone, and for the first time in my life, I felt this quiet kind of purpose, like maybe my hands were meant for this. The funny thing about small towns is that people notice everything. After that day, neighbors started calling me whenever their dog seemed off or when a calf wouldn't eat. I didn't know what I was doing, really. I'd flip through the tattered books in the town library or ask my father, who didn't know much about animals, but admired my determination. And then there was the smell. It's strange what sticks with you. The smell of barns, mixtures of hay, manure, sweat, and leather. Most kids hated it. But for me, it became the scent of possibility, of beginnings. Every time I walked into one, my heart beat faster, like I was walking into the place where my future waited. Looking back now, I see how clear the path was even then. But as a boy, I just knew one thing. Animals trusted me. And, in a way, I trusted them more than people. By the time I was a teenager, folks in town had started calling me the kid with the steady hands. I didn't know what that meant back then, but I suppose even as a boy, I had a way of calming animals, of holding them without making them feel trapped. When I was 14, I got my first real job working weekends at the Miller farm. They raised dairy cows and a few horses, and I was mostly hired to muck stalls and haul hay. It wasn't glamorous. My boots were always caked in mud and manure, and the summer heat made the barn reek like ammonia. But I loved every minute of it. I loved the rhythm of it, the way animals looked at you when you entered their world. I'll never forget one evening when a calf was born too weak to stand. Mr. Miller, a big man with rough hands and little patience, muttered that it probably wouldn't make it through the night. But I couldn't accept that. I spent hours sitting in the straw, coaxing a bottle into the calf's mouth, whispering to it as though my voice alone could convince it to keep living. That calf did survive, and Mr. Miller looked at me differently from then on. He didn't say much, but when he handed me my pay that week, he gripped my shoulder and nodded. That was all the encouragement I needed. It was around then that the idea of becoming a veterinarian stopped being a dream and started becoming a goal. My high school counselor thought it was ambitious for a boy from a working-class family. College wasn't something people in my neighborhood talked about much. But I had this fire in me, a conviction that I couldn't ignore. Of course, teenage years aren't just work and dreams. I had friends. I went to football games. I even fell in love for the first time with a girl named Linda who smelled like lilacs and drove a rusted Ford. But even in the middle of teenage laughter and dances in the school gym, part of me always drifted back to the barn, to the quiet heartbeat of the animals I felt responsible for. Sometimes I think that responsibility, carrying it so young, made me grow up quicker than most. And maybe that's why, now at 65, when I see an old dog waiting faithfully by a door, the boy in me still stirs. Leaving my hometown was harder than I thought it would be. I remember standing on the porch that last morning, suitcase by my side, the air cool with early autumn. The maples were just beginning to turn, and the whole street smelled of burning leaves, neighbors clearing their yards before winter. I'd grown up on that street, ridden my bike past those porches, waved to those same faces for nearly 18 years. And now I was leaving, not knowing when or if I'd ever come back the same. Veterinary school wasn't close. It meant packing up, catching a greyhound, and stepping into a world much bigger than the one I knew. The city was loud, and for the first time in my life, I felt small. But beneath all that fear was a current of excitement. I had finally put my feet on the path I dreamed about since I was a boy tending barn cats and weak calves. The classes were harder than anything I had imagined. Biology, anatomy, pharmacology, words that felt heavy in my mouth, concepts that twisted my mind into knots. I spent nights hunched over borrowed textbooks in the dorm, fueled by bad coffee and determination. Some nights I doubted myself. I'd think, maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I should have stayed back home and worked the farms. But then came the hands-on work. The first time I was allowed to assist in a small procedure, the sterile smell of disinfectant in the air, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above, I felt alive in a way no textbook could explain. My hands remembered what my heart already knew. I belonged here.
I worked part-time in the university's animal clinic to help pay tuition. Dogs with broken legs, cats with fevers, even the occasional bird brought in by a worried owner. They all became my teachers. I learned more from the look in an animal's eye than I ever did from a lecture. Of course, being young and away from home wasn't all discipline. I made friends, some of whom are still etched in my memory. John, who dreamed of becoming a zoo vet, Mary, who played the violin and studied late with me in the library, and others who burned bright in my life for a season and then drifted away. I even fell in love again, briefly, with a girl named Susan, who said my hands always smelled like soap and straw. She laughed when I told her that was probably true.
Still, beneath every experience was that anchor, my purpose. I wasn't just studying medicine. I was studying a way to live, to serve, to be useful in a world that often feels too vast and uncaring. And by the time I graduated, white coat on my shoulders, and my parents watching proudly from the bleachers, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was ready to go back to a small town, to where animals needed me most. After graduation, when the world seemed to be pointing me towards city practices and big hospitals, I chose the opposite. I took a job in a small Midwestern town, one of those places with a single blinking traffic light, a diner that closed at 8 p.m., and neighbors who knew your business before you did. The clinic was modest, a squat brick building with peeling white trim and a screen door that creaked every time it opened. Inside, the smell was a mix of rubbing alcohol, hay tracked in on boots, and that faint sweetness of animal fur that never really leaves the air. The waiting room had 2 wooden benches, a counter with a bell that jingled when pressed, and a stack of magazines so old the covers curled. I remember my very first patient as if it were yesterday. A farmer brought in his border collie, Duke, who had a deep cut on his paw from a rusty fence. The dog limped in, tail wagging faintly, trusting me before I had even earned it. My hands trembled as I cleaned the wound, stitched it up under the farmer's watchful eyes. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. When I tied the final knot and Duke licked my wrist, something inside me settled. I was where I was meant to be. The people of that town didn't welcome me right away. They needed proof that a young man with a clean coat and city education could really understand their lives. But animals have a way of bridging gaps. Each calf I saved, each lame horse I treated, each dog I soothed when a child cried, those became my introductions. Trust came slow, but it came. I worked long hours. Early mornings were often spent on farms, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air, my boots sinking in mud as I leaned over a cow in labor. Afternoons brought cats and dogs through the clinic door, pets who were more like family to the folks who brought them in. Evenings often meant emergency calls, headlights cutting through country roads as I drove out to barns in the dark. It was exhausting. My hands were raw from washing, my shirt stained, my body aching. Yet I never went to bed without a sense of purpose humming in my chest. Gratitude came in small forms: a handshake, a jar of homemade jam left on my counter, a farmer's quiet thank you, said with more weight than the words themselves carried. I was young, full of fire, and unaware of how those years would shape me. At the time, I thought it was just work. Looking back now, I see it was the beginning of a life. Life in that little town didn't stay just about work for long. You can't spend day after day in barns, homes, and kitchens without weaving yourself into the fabric of the place. Soon, I wasn't just the new vet, I was part of their lives. There was Tom, the feed store owner,
who always slipped me an extra sack of grain when I was bottle-feeding orphaned calves. There was Mrs. Fletcher, an elderly widow with 3 cats who insisted on baking me pies every time I stopped by. And then there were the farmers, the Millers, the Johnsons, the Harts, families who worked dawn to dusk, whose hands were thick with calluses, but who trusted me with the animals that kept their lives afloat. And of course, there was Love. Her name was Linda, different from the lilac-scented girl of my teenage years, though I often thought about that coincidence. She came to the clinic with a shepherd mix named Rusty, who had a broken leg from chasing a truck. She had auburn hair, freckles across her cheeks, and eyes that didn't flinch when they looked into mine. While Rusty healed in my care, so did I, though I hadn't even realized something in me was aching until she walked through that door. We started seeing each other. Picnics by the river, late-night talks on her porch, dances at the community hall where the jukebox never played the same song twice in one night. For a while, I thought it was heading toward forever. But small towns are funny that way. What seems steady can shift overnight. Linda had dreams bigger than the town. She wanted to travel, to see coasts and cities, to live a life that stretched beyond county lines.
I wanted the opposite. I wanted the barns, the animals, the steady rhythm of being needed. And so, one autumn evening, as the air smelled of wood smoke and Rusty lay sleeping at our feet, we said goodbye. She left for Chicago. I stayed. Heartbreak at that age feels like it'll never fade. But work has a way of filling empty spaces. The clinic needed me. The farmers called. The animals suffered and healed. And slowly, the sharp edges of loss softened into memory. In those years, I learned that being part of a community meant carrying not only my own stories, but the stories of everyone around me. Their joys became mine, their griefs too. And though I sometimes lay awake at night wondering what might have been, I never doubted that I was where I belonged. The first time I lost an animal under my care, I remember every detail. A dairy cow, heavy with calf, brought in late one night. The farmer's hands were trembling as he explained she'd been laboring too long. I worked with every ounce of skill I had, sweat soaking through my shirt as the night stretched into morning. But sometimes nature wins, no matter how hard you fight. The cow didn't make it. The farmer didn't yell. He didn't blame me. He just lowered his head, patted my shoulder, and walked away. That silence was worse than any anger. It stayed with me for weeks. The feeling of being helpless, of not being enough. People often think veterinarians just cuddle puppies and hand out treats. They don't see the long nights, the blood on your sleeves, the moments when you hold a family's pet in your arms as it takes its last breath, and you have to be the strong one. They don't see the way you drive home after midnight, headlights slicing through empty roads, and the tears finally come when no one is watching. But loss, as crushing as it was, came hand in hand with something else. Gratitude. For every animal I couldn't save, there were dozens I could. The look in a child's eyes when their dog limped out of the clinic, stitched and safe. The relief on a farmer's face when his prized mare stood tall again after weeks of treatment. Those moments stitched me back together. I started to realize that being a vet wasn't just about medicine. It was about carrying the weight others couldn't. People leaned on me in their moments of fear and despair, and I learned to stand steady. even when, inside, I was trembling. Those years hardened me, but they softened me too. Hardened my resolve, softened my heart. I began to understand that the work wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, giving everything you had, and being there for both the living and the dying. And in a small town, word spread quickly. With every call I answered, every animal I cared for, the town's trust grew. I was no longer the new vet. I was their vet. And that meant more than any diploma hanging on the wall. Over the years, I began to feel the town wrap around me like a warm, familiar blanket. The first mornings were still lonely, the streets quiet in that way that made you ache for someone to call. But slowly, the routine, the work, and the people became my heartbeat. I'd get up before sunrise, the smell of dew on the grass mingling with the faint scent of my coffee, and walk the few blocks to the clinic. The bell above the door jingled every time someone entered, and I started recognizing footsteps, voices, even the rhythm of hooves on gravel from a distance. I knew who would stop by to chat about crops, who would bring in kittens they'd found under their porch, who would simply nod and smile as they handed me a jar of homemade preserves. Friendships grew like the wildflowers along the country roads. John, my old classmate from vet school, would call to check in or drop by with his own practice problems. Mrs. Fletcher still sent pies, though now she insisted I eat them before tending to the next patient. And then there were the children, who came with their pets in tow, their laughter echoing through the waiting room. I loved seeing the awe in their eyes when a little puppy wagged and jumped, like the world hadn't hardened them yet.
Work was still hard, of course. Animals fell sick, accidents happened, and the weight of responsibility never left. But I learned to find joy in the small victories. A limp that became a trot, a fever that finally broke, a bird that took flight after days of careful care. These moments stitched life together in ways I never expected. And slowly, I began to see the town as family. It wasn't just where I worked, it was where my heart settled. Even after heartbreaks and the losses that left me awake at night, this place gave me a sense of purpose. Here I mattered. My hands, my knowledge, my time, they all meant something. Sometimes, when a dog waited patiently by the store entrance or a cat purred in a child's arms, I felt a quiet thrill in my chest. That was the proof of a life well lived. That was home. It wasn't until years later that love found me again. Her name was Margaret. She wasn't flashy or loud, but there was a steadiness about her, like the slow, certain flow of a river. She came into the clinic one rainy afternoon with a tiny, shivering kitten she'd found on the roadside. I remember the way her coat smelled of rain and pine, the soft warmth of her hands as she handed me the trembling bundle. We started talking, then meeting for coffee, then for walks through the town park where leaves crunched underfoot and children chased each other with wild abandon. Margaret understood the rhythm of my life, the long hours, the emergency calls, the quiet nights spent watching over a sick animal. She never complained, she simply became part of the life I had built, filling in the spaces I didn't even know were empty. We married in the small chapel on Main Street, the same one where generations of townsfolk had tied their lives together. There was no grand festivities, just neighbors, friends, and the faint smell of rain on old wood. But it was perfect. It felt like the town itself was celebrating with us. And then came our children. First a daughter, then a son. They grew up surrounded by animals,
by the smell of hay and coffee, by the stories I told them of barns, clinics, and the people who shaped my life. They learned to feed the chickens, bandage a wound, and listen carefully to the quiet language of animals. Watching them, I realized how much of myself I had poured into this town, into my work, into the people I loved. And somehow it came back to me, multiplied in their laughter and curiosity. Those years were a delicate balance of work, family, and community. Some days the weight of responsibility felt too heavy, but Margaret's quiet strength, the children's smiles, and the town's trust kept me steady. I was no longer just a young vet fighting to prove himself. I was a father, a husband, a friend, and still a veterinarian, though older now, with hands calloused and steady, shaped by decades of service. Looking back, I can see how these years rooted me. The town, the people, the animals, they became extensions of myself. And in that belonging, I found a kind of happiness I hadn't even known I was searching for. Life has a way of testing you, often when you least expect it. One summer, a mysterious illness began to sweep through the town's livestock. Farmers came to the clinic one by one, faces etched with worry, voices tight with fear. I spent days running tests, making house calls, and consulting with specialists over the phone. Nights were short. Sometimes I slept in the clinic, listening to the occasional cough or whimper from a recovering animal. There were moments when I felt helpless. When the first calf I treated didn't respond to medication, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. I questioned myself. Am I doing enough? Did I miss something? But then, slowly, one by one, the animals began to recover. A cow stood again, a horse pranced down the field, and the gratitude in the farmer's eyes reminded me why I had chosen this life. And it wasn't just illness. Accidents happened, storms knocked down fences, pets went missing, and emergencies came at the most inconvenient times. I learned to adapt, to stay calm under pressure, to find solutions when it seemed none existed. Those years taught me resilience. Not the loud kind that everyone notices, but the quiet kind that carries you through sleepless nights and long drives on empty country roads.
Yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of unexpected beauty. One evening, a storm had passed, leaving the fields glistening and the air sharp and clean. A farmer's dog, once sick and weak, bounded toward me with joy, leaping through puddles and mud. I laughed, something I hadn't done in hours, and felt a warmth spread through my chest. It was in those moments I realized that life in a small town wasn't predictable, and that unpredictability, as stressful as it was, made the victories sweeter. Those trials, those unexpected turns, shaped me. They made me not just a vet, but a part of the town's pulse. They reminded me that even in hardship, there is gratitude, trust, and small, fleeting sparks of joy that make everything worthwhile. Middle age came quietly, almost without warning. My hair was streaked with gray, my hands no longer as nimble as they had been, but my heart was still tied to the work I had devoted my life to. The town had grown used to me, the vet who would answer a call at 2 a.m, who knew every animal and almost every person by name. But life, as always, carries both joy and sorrow. Margaret fell ill one winter. I remember the bitter cold outside as I drove to the clinic to fetch medication, my mind clouded with worry. That period reminded me of the fragility of life, not just animals, but human life too. I spent long nights at home, sitting by her side, holding her hand, whispering words I hoped would bring comfort. And yet, even amidst loss, life moved forward. Our children grew,
carrying pieces of this town and of me into their own journeys. I watched them stumble, succeed, fall in love, make mistakes, and sometimes I saw reflections of myself in them, the curiosity and empathy that had first led me to animals. I began to take on apprentices at the clinic, younger vets fresh out of school, eager and nervous. I showed them not just how to stitch a wound or diagnose a fever, but how to carry the weight of responsibility with quiet dignity. I taught them the smells of the barns, the subtle signs that an animal is in pain, and the way a farmer's eyes speak volumes without words. Passing on knowledge became a new kind of joy. Watching them learn, watching the trust of the town slowly extend to them, reminded me that life and the work I loved would continue even after I stepped away. Those years were reflective. I counted victories and losses, joys and sorrows, and realized that every scar, every gray hair, and every sleepless night had shaped me into the man I had become. A man who had loved, lost, healed, and been healed in return. By the time I reached my late 50s, I had settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and profound. The clinic no longer felt like a place of endless struggle. It had become a second home, filled with the familiar smells of disinfectant, hay, and animal fur. I knew every corner, every creaky floorboard, every faded stain on the walls, each a memory of a patient, a challenge, a moment that mattered. I found myself taking pleasure in small things. The soft whine of a recovering dog, the twitch of a cat's ear when it recognized my voice, the way a farmer's shoulders relaxed once their livestock was safe. Even the quiet mornings, walking the empty streets with a steaming cup of coffee, felt like a reward. I had earned the right to notice them, to breathe them in, and to appreciate the life I had built. I started to slow down, letting the younger vets take the late-night calls and the emergencies that used to drain me. And yet, I never felt irrelevant. Every visit I made, every patient I treated, reminded me that experience mattered, that a steady hand and a calm heart could mean the difference between fear and comfort, life and loss. There were moments of reflection, too. I'd sit in my office after a long day, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the trees outside, and remember the boy I once was, the one carrying a limping cat in his hands, trembling with purpose. I'd smile at how far I had come, at how those early sparks of curiosity and care had grown into a lifetime of service. I began to realize that satisfaction wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about knowing, deep in your bones, that your work mattered, that you had loved, you had healed, and you had been present in the moments that truly counted. And for me, that was enough. Retirement was never something I imagined for myself when I was young. I thought I would keep going until my hands could no longer hold a stethoscope, until the town no longer called my name. But as the years passed, I felt a gentle tug, a whisper reminding me that every chapter eventually ends, even the ones we love most. I began to notice the small changes in myself. Mornings were slower, my joints a little stiffer, my eyes a fraction less sharp when examining a faint lameness or spotting a subtle sign of illness. Emergencies that once invigorated me now left me tired in a way I hadn't known. And yet, stepping back didn't feel like giving up. It felt like making space for the younger vets, for the future, for myself. The thought of leaving the clinic stirred a strange mix of fear and relief. I wondered if I would miss the familiar smells, the steady rhythm of the town, the trust in the farmer's eyes, the soft nudge of a grateful dog against my leg. But I also realized that I had earned the right to rest, to watch my children grow into adults, to spend mornings on the porch with Margaret, and to feel the quiet joy of simply being alive, without constant demands. I started slowing down deliberately, letting apprentices handle more, delegating tasks I once insisted on doing myself. I took longer walks, spent more time in the garden, lingered over cups of coffee while the sun crept over the fields. And in those quiet moments, I realized something profound. The life I had built, the work I had devoted myself to, had left a legacy, not just in animals healed, but in people inspired, in trust earned, in the town's heartbeat that I had been part of for decades. It was time to step aside, but not to leave behind. Retirement didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could finally reflect, savor, and be grateful for every day I had lived this life I had chosen. The last week at the clinic came quietly, without fanfare. I didn't want a ceremony or applause. I wanted to leave the way I had lived, steadily, with care, with gratitude. But the town had other ideas. Farmers stopped by with flowers, a basket of eggs, or a loaf of homemade bread. Children handed me drawings of dogs and cats, scribbled hearts around my name. Even old Mrs. Fletcher, her hands trembling, pressed a pie into my arms, insisting I take it home and enjoy it. Each goodbye was a small ache in my chest. Saying farewell to the animals felt almost impossible. Each one had a story, a memory, a bond. Duke, the border collie from my first year, now old and gray, pressed his nose into my hand one last time. I patted him slowly, trying to memorize the warmth of his fur, the softness of his eyes. I spent my final day walking through the clinic room by room. I traced my fingers over the walls, the counters, the familiar creaks of the floorboards. Every corner held a memory, the late nights, the emergency calls, the triumphs and heartbreaks. I whispered quiet thanks to each room, to each animal that had taught me something about life, trust, and love. When I finally locked the door for the last time, I felt a profound mixture of sadness and peace. The work that had defined me for decades was leaving my hands, but not my heart. I had given everything I had, and the town had given back in trust, gratitude, and love. The streets that once felt so wide and unfamiliar now felt like home. And though I would no longer walk these halls daily, their echoes would remain inside me forever. As I drove away, the smell of the fields and barns lingered in my senses. I realized that life, in its messy, beautiful, unpredictable way, had been generous, and I was ready to embrace the quiet that followed, carrying every story, every lesson, every memory with me. Now, at 65, I often sit on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. The town is quiet, the streets familiar, and I watch dogs trot beside their owners, cats bask in the sun, and children chase each other across lawns. I see life continuing just as it always has, and I smile
I think about the boy I once was, trembling with a wounded cat in his arms. I think about the young man leaving for veterinary school, scared and hopeful. I think about the years in the clinic, the long nights, the losses, the moments of joy, the friendships, the heartbreaks, the births and recoveries. Every experience, every challenge, every bond shaped me into the man I am now. I feel grateful. Grateful for the animals that trusted me, the families that relied on me, the community that became my second family. Grateful for Margaret, who stayed by my side, for our children who carry pieces of this life into their own. Grateful for the lessons learned in barns, in clinics, in quiet moments of reflection. And though I have retired, I am not empty. My heart is full of memories, of love, of purpose. I see now that life is not measured by accolades or wealth, but by the care we give, the bonds we form, and the difference we make in the lives of others, human or animal. Sometimes when I pass the old clinic, I pause. I close my eyes and breathe in the faint scent of disinfectant, hay, and animal fur. I smile, knowing I lived fully, loved deeply, and gave all that I could. And in that quiet satisfaction, I find peace. Yes, I am happy. I am proud. I am grateful. I lived a life of purpose, and it was exactly the life I was meant to live.